This video is going to get me in a lot of trouble. In a previous video, I talked about how much time it takes to have a fish room like this. In this video, as promised, we're going to talk about the costs. I've actually never added up the cost of building out this fish room before, so stay tuned. Alright, so before we talk about the cost of this fish room, I'd like to take a step back. I'm about 6 or 7 years old, I'm a little kid, and I get my first fish, and from that point forward, I was hooked. And one of my best memories is when my dad used to take us to the pet store on Saturday mornings, and if I knew we were going on a Saturday morning, I looked forward to it all week long. And there was nothing better than walking into that pet store, and in the front of the pet store, there was dry goods and other animals, but in the back was the fish room. And what was cool is the only lights that were coming from that room were from the tanks themselves. The walls, the floor, everything else was black. You just had the tanks. And I remember just the sounds and the sights, and it was just so awesome. And so my whole life, I dreamt about replicating that, about having a fish room. And I don't just mean in a figurative sense. Yeah, I thought about it, but I literally used to have dreams, even as an adult, of having a fish room. And you have this awesome dream, like, oh my gosh, I've got all these tanks and all these fish. And then you wake up, you're like, oh man, it's not true. So that's what I was trying to replicate. So now we fast forward a few years ago, Joanna comes to me and says, hey, you know what? I don't want my craft room in the basement anymore. I don't like it down there. It's dark. Nobody's down there. There's spiders down there. I want to move it upstairs to the loft. Now at the time, the loft was my office. And so I thought about it for a second. I said, okay, sure. Go ahead. And we'll go ahead and move your craft room up into the office. And that way you can be around the family more. It's not dark. There's windows. It'll be a great thing. I'm not kidding you. The next day, the very next day, she went to work and the boys and I were still off because it was the summertime. Her craft area looked like this. Within the span of her leaving for work and coming home, we made it look like this. And so she comes home and we're sitting there on the couch, we're exhausted and we're kind of smiling, and she's like, what did you guys do? And Luke and Eli just kind of glanced up to the loft area, and she looks up and she's like, oh my gosh, all her stuff from the craft room was now in the loft. Her very next question, what did you do to the basement? And I walked her down here and I showed her a perfectly clean room. And she looked at me and she knew something was up. And she said, what are you planning to do down here? I said, well, you said I could have the basement, right? She said, yes. And I said, well, you said I could decorate it however I want because the basement is now mine. It's my man cave. Yes, I said that. And that's when I told her, I want to build a fish room down here. And she just kind of looked at me, kind of like out of the corner of her eye, and she kind of half smiled. And she knew I can never do anything halfway. When I do something, I go all in. And so from that point forward, that was what we did. We built the fish room, we put in the tanks, we put in the stands, all the wastewater system, the air system, and it took a couple months, but we finally got it done. So what we're going to talk about today is what the cost was for building out this fish room. Because one of the things that I think we don't talk about enough on YouTube is it looks really cool. They have a lot of fish tanks and a lot of fish and have all these things going on, but there is a cost associated with that. And I want to make sure we have a realistic idea of what it costs to get something like this up and running. All right, everybody. So what does it cost to get a fish room up and running the size of ours? Now, I want to say some things from the outset. And thing number one is I wasn't going for the cheapest possible options. One of the things that you have to decide for yourself, how are you going to be using your fish room? Is it something that is strictly for breeding? Is it something that you want aesthetically pleasing? Is it something where you're going to try to blend the two? For us, I wanted something that was going to look visually appealing, at least for me, but still manage the costs well. So there was a blending between the two. So not everything we did was the cheapest way to go. And I'll try to point that out. If there's cheaper ways to do it, I will point that out throughout the video. However, we wanted to strike a balance between something that looked good and something that was still feasible. And you're going to find out, even with something like this, where we're trying to save money in certain places, it can still get pretty expensive. In our fish room down here, we have 53 tanks up and running, including our fry bins. There are 7 upstairs. So for the tanks, just for the tanks alone, the vast majority of the tanks that we bought came from the Petco $1 per gallon sale. The only exceptions to that were the 475 gallons, the 125, and the 150. But to get all of the tanks in this room, that was $3,000. Now, if you have tanks, you have to have stands to put them on. All of the stands that are in our fish room, I have built with the exception of the stand that's holding up the 125 and the stand that's holding up the 150. But when I looked at the cost of the wood, I looked at the cost of the screws, which is very expensive. I looked at the cost of the paint, and in some cases we have plywood. The cost of all the stands in our fish room, that was about $1,100. Now keep in mind, this is not taking into consideration any of the time it took me to build those stands. So that's another $1,100. This next part was probably the most shocking part when I went through and I added up all the costs of our fish room. Lighting. Lighting was really expensive, and I really didn't realize it until I went through and added up the costs of all the lights that we have. $2,400, just over $2,400 to put all the lights in. Now, this is an area where you can save a lot of money. You don't have to spend $2,400 on this many tanks. We did. Why? I really like the Phoenix lights. I've got a video that I've done about those Phoenix lights. I will put a card in the upper right-hand corner so that you can look at that video. I like those lights. They are a great blend of giving us the proper amount of light. They grow a lot of low to medium light plants. Could I have gone with a cheaper option? Absolutely. But the problem is, for a lot of the cheaper options, I really don't like the spectrum of light that they produce. So I went with Phoenix lights for the vast majority of our tanks. We still have some old school fluorescent lights. We have a couple of off brands as well, but that was a significant cost to our fish room. All right, so right now we've got the tanks, we've got the stands, we've got the lights. We need to paint the back of the tanks, at least I do. Again, you don't have to do this. This could save you money. We did, and I think I spent about $100 to $150 just in acrylic paint to paint the backs of all these tanks. The other thing that you're gonna wanna consider is lids. Almost all of our tanks have lids, with very, very few exceptions. And that cuts down tremendously on humidity. It keeps fish in the tank and not on the floor. And this is an area where we did try to save a significant amount of money by going with the polycarbonate lids. They're on many of our tanks, but not all. My estimation is that we spent somewhere between $500 to $600 just covering our tanks. Could you do it even cheaper? Absolutely. But again, we wanted something that was going to allow the light through. We also wanted something that wasn't going to look too bad. So right around $500 to $600 for all the lids on our tanks. Another significant portion of the cost of a fish room is filtration. All of these tanks have some type of filtration, whether that's run by air and sponge filters, and a few of our tanks still have hang on the back filters. This can be a significant cost. We bought not one, but 2 air pumps. Now, again, this is an area where you're probably going to save a lot of money if you do it right the first time. But the first pump that we bought, the LPH 45, I believe it was, from Gemco, that cost us a couple $100, and it worked for us for a long time until we started adding a lot more tanks. We had to go out and buy the next level up, the LPH 60, I believe it is. That costs another $250. So right there, we're at $450 in pumps. The one thing I will say, it's a very bad idea to rely on one pump and one pump only. If that pump went out, and it was something that I constantly thought about when we only had the first pump, if our original pump went down, what were we going to do? This is something where you just can't run out real quick to Petco or PetSmart and buy a new giant central air pump. And so one of the things that we did, once we put in the new pump, I kept the older one. Just in case of an emergency, if the new one goes down, I can shut down some of the tanks that have double sponge filters, run the old one, and we will get by until I can either replace or fix the larger pump. In addition to that, you have to start thinking about how are you going to get the air from the pump to the tanks. And so we have a PVC system all around our fish room. Probably spent another $100 to $150 on all the PVC and the silicone and the brackets to hold everything up in the ceiling and on the walls. And then from the PVC to the tanks, we had to get the little brass valves. We didn't have to get the brass valves. Again, this is a place where you can save some money, but I love the brass valves that we use. I have a video on our air filtration system and our air system. I will put that in the upper right hand corner as well. But those brass valves for me are the only way to go. I would never use anything else. They're self-tapping, they're awesome. But those cost a lot of money. In addition to the brass valves, you also have the tubing. We might have spent $60 or so on the tubing. The brass valves, by the way, they probably cost somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple $100, $150 or so for the number of valves that we have in our fish room. Now, once you get the air into the tank, how are you going to filter everything? That takes sponge filters. The sponge filters alone cost about $400. A lot of our tanks are running double sponge filters, and that's just buying them in bulk. So again, this is the cheapest way to run multiple tanks, is to run it with air and to run it with sponge filters and using the valves. Also, one of the things that we do, and this is an area where you could probably save some money, but we run never clog air stones, and I will put a video in the upper right hand corner or in the description to show you those. But we run those things because I like to be able to adjust the strength or the size of the bubbles that are coming out of those sponge filters. You can do it to a certain extent by adjusting the amount of air that's coming through the filter, but it's a lot easier to adjust the actual size of the bubbles and therefore the noise if you've got those never clog air filters. So the air system, when it was all said and done, was about $1,100. But that's not the only filtration we run. We've got some larger tanks and some tanks that are heavily stocked that require additional mechanical filtration. So we've still got 4 or 5 hang on the back filters down here in the basement. That easily added another $140 to $150 just in those filters as well. All right, the other system that we have a wastewater system. Now this is not super complex, and in fact, this is probably the cheapest way you can run water changes, and that is we manually do our water changes. Our siphons run directly into some PVC that goes all around the perimeter of both sides of the fish room. I've shown you that when we talked about how we change water in the fish room. That wasn't super expensive. That might have only cost $100 or so, including the PVC and the silicone and the brackets, maybe 150 tops, but it's a very cheap way to do water. It would be far more expensive, although it would save a lot of time, with an auto water change system. But again, that was a decision that we made based on our needs. It's been working out great for us. If you're building a fish room and want to look at auto water change, by all means, that might be a great idea, but know that it's going to be a little bit more expensive to build that system in place. All right, so at this point, we've got the tanks, we've got the stands, we've got the backgrounds painted, we've got the lights on, we've got the filtration system set up, we have the wastewater system ready to go. It seems like most of what we need is in place, but there are a lot of things that can be easily forgotten about that will add a significant cost to building out a fish room. Thing number one, how are you going to properly control humidity? Even with the tanks covered, humidity with a lot of tanks in a small space can still be an issue. So thing number one, we went out and bought a dehumidifier. That was a couple $100. The second thing that we did is we bought a monitor that monitors the humidity and the temperature in the fish room. That was another $20 or so. The next thing you have to think about is how are you going to heat the tanks? Originally, we bought heaters and decided to heat the individual tanks and spent about $500 or $600 on those heaters. Later on, after we built more of the fish room out, I realized that was not going to be a sustainable thing to do. We decided to heat the room itself, and so we bought a space heater. That was another $100 or $150. We wound up selling a lot of the heaters at auction, but still, that was a significant cost, and it's a cost that you can avoid if you decide to heat the room. The space heater will only cost you about $100 to $150, at least ours. Will maintain the temperature in the basement pretty well without having any issues. Here's something that often gets overlooked, and it's actually really important. Power. How are you going to deal with all the power needs in your fish room? So yes, heating the room instead of the tanks, that's going to go a long way in making things easier to deal with. But we've got a lot of tanks that have a lot of lights, which means you're going to need some outlets. And if you don't have the proper number of outlets, you may need some power strips. I went around and I actually counted the number of power strips that we have, and I think we're up to about 20. Now, those power strips are there for a reason, and one reason is some of the power strips are running lights which are on timers, and other power strips are there and they can be on all the time. So if I've got a few heaters and some remaining tanks, or I want to plug something in, those power strips are available. But those power strips, 20 of them might run you up $300. The other thing are the timers themselves. I went around the fish room and counted the number of timers we have. We've got about 6 of them. That added another $60 or $70. So again, the little things that you don't think about tend to add up. Even things like nets. If you're going to have a number of tanks, you're going to need fish nets. Well, you might want to add $30 to $50 for the proper number of nets. One of the things that we had to put in our fish room, and you may not have to do this because it may already be there for you, but we needed running water. So we spent $600 having a sink installed down here, and that has made a world of difference. But it was something we needed. Again, that might be a place where you save money. You may not need it. All right, so here's the bottom line. I went through and I added up everything, and we're pretty close to $11,000. Yeah, that's a lot of money. I'm probably gonna need a place to sleep tonight. So it's something to think about when you see these large fish rooms and you're looking at how cool that would be. It takes a lot of time, like I mentioned in the first part of this series, but it also takes a lot of money. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll notice I've left out some super important costs to the fish room. I never talked about a single thing actually going into the tank. Not once. I didn't mention substrate, I didn't mention rocks, I didn't mention wood, or plants, fake or real, or special little caves, or bubbly guys. I didn't mention fish. Why? Because that is a very personal choice, and that is going to have a big impact. Your choices will have a huge impact on how much that actually costs. Some people might just run a bare bottom tank, and mostly bare tanks because they're into breeding. Other people might want to have these tanks aquascaped as best they can, in which case that's going to cost a significant amount of money. The fish that you buy and the fish that you keep is also going to play a major role in the overall cost. But just to get the tanks and all the infrastructure around it, you're looking at, for a fish room this size, maybe 11 grand. You can do it a lot cheaper. I've said that before. Yes, you could have stands with 2x4s and cinder blocks, and that's awesome if you do that. It's just not something that we personally wanted. Yes, you could go cheaper on filtration potentially. You could find better deals on polycarbonate. Maybe you could pick up a lot of your tanks used or on Craigslist or garbage pick them for all I know and find them a lot cheaper. For us, I didn't want to worry about used tanks and how they've been treated and where they've been and if they've been sitting dry and if they're dry rotted. I am not going to spend the time to reseal them. I wanted to have new tanks that I knew, at least chances are they're going to be in pretty good shape. All right, everyone, so I hope you found that useful. I also wanted to say thank you. I don't say it enough, but thank you for all that you do, for the encouraging comments you leave, for sharing our videos, for meeting us at swaps and auctions and Aquatic Experience and Aquashello. We love meeting you. I love reading your comments. So I just wanted to tell you how much we appreciate that. If you found this video useful, share, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. It's shocking. Like, what in the world was that? I don't know who jumped back there, but there's water on the floor now.